I found out my father's cattle were gone on a Tuesday morning. Not missing, not stolen, sold, and the person who sold them was someone I trusted. At first, I honestly thought there had to be some mistake. My dad had spent years building that herd. Those cattle weren't just animals to me. They were part of the ranch he had worked his whole life to build. So I called him, "Where are Dad's cattle?" He didn't sound nervous. He didn't even sound guilty. "They're gone," he said. I had to make a decision. A decision? That two-word answer hit me harder than I expected. Because he hadn't just moved a few cows around, he had sold them behind my back, and somehow he believed he had the right to. Do it? Maybe you know what that feels like? When someone sees you going through a hard time and mistakes your silence for weakness, when they think you'll be too overwhelmed to push back. For a moment, I wondered if I should just let it go. Then I looked across my father's ranch, and something inside me changed. This wasn't about a few cattle anymore. It was one simple question. Who gave him the right to sell them? I didn't know the answer yet, but I was about to find out. And what I discovered next made me realize the cattle might have been only the beginning. The next morning, I went looking for an answer. I didn't confront him. Not yet. First, I wanted to know exactly what gave him the right to sell my father's cattle. That's when I heard the story he'd been telling everyone. According to him, my father had trusted him to handle things after he passed. That was his explanation. But when I asked him when Dad had supposedly given him that authority, he couldn't give me a date. He just shrugged. Your dad knew what he wanted. That answer bothered me because my father was many things, but careless wasn't one of them. If Dad wanted someone to handle his ranch, he would have made that clear. And he definitely wouldn't have expected me to find out after the cattle were already gone. Still, I had been grieving. I was tired. And after Dad died, I had let people around me make decisions because, honestly, I didn't have the strength to question everything. Maybe he thought that made me easy to push around. But he forgot something. My father had spent years teaching me how to recognize when something didn't feel right. So I started looking through the things Dad left behind. Old papers, notes, records, anything that could tell me what he had actually intended. And then I found something that made me stop cold. There was a reason this man thought he could sell my father's cattle. And the more I looked, the more I realized he hadn't been acting alone. The first thing I found was a note in one of my father's old folders. It wasn't a long letter, just a few lines in Dad's handwriting. I read it once, then again, and my heart sank because the name mentioned in that note was his, the same man who had just sold my father's cattle. For a second, I thought I had been wrong. Maybe Dad really had trusted him. Maybe there was an explanation. Then I noticed the date. The note had been written years before my father died, and it wasn't giving him control of the ranch. Dad had simply asked him to help with a few repairs and keep an eye on the property while Dad was away. That was it. Somehow, that small favor had turned into a story that made him sound like my father's chosen successor. I sat there staring at the page. He hadn't misunderstood my father. He had taken one small piece of trust and turned it into something it was never meant to be. But then I found something else. Tucked underneath the note was a receipt from the cattle sale. The buyer's name was written across the top, and next to it was another name. Someone I recognized immediately. Someone who had been around our ranch for years. My hands actually went cold because now I had a new question. Why was that person's name next to the buyer's? And I had a feeling the answer was going to be a whole lot worse than I expected. I knew that name. It belonged to a man who had worked around our ranch for years. He knew the cattle, he knew the property, and most importantly, he knew my father. So I called him at first. He acted like nothing was wrong. Then I mentioned the cattle sale. There was a long silence. That silence told me more than his words could have. Finally, he admitted he had been there when the deal was discussed, but he swore he hadn't known the cattle were being sold without my permission. Then I asked him one simple question. Who brought up the sale? He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, he gave me a name. The same man I had already confronted. I felt my stomach drop, so I asked why he had gone along with it. His answer made everything worse. He told me you were planning to sell the ranch anyway. I just sat there, because that wasn't true. I had never told anyone I was selling my father's ranch. Not him, not anybody. Then he said something that made me grab the old receipt again. He said you didn't know yet. I couldn't believe it. They hadn't been waiting for me to approve the sale. They had been planning around me. And suddenly, the cattle weren't the real mystery anymore. I needed to know one thing. Why did they believe I was going to lose the ranch? So I went back. through Dad's papers. This time, I wasn't looking for cattle records. I was looking for anything that could explain why they were so confident I wouldn't be able to stop them. And what I found next made me realize this had started long before that Tuesday morning. I went through every folder my father had left behind. I wasn't looking for anything complicated. I just wanted to understand why they were so sure I couldn't stop them. Then I found an old letter from Dad. It was written a few months before he died. One sentence made me sit back in my chair. He had written that the ranch needed to stay in the family. Not eventually. Not if things worked out. He wanted it kept in the family. That changed everything. Because if Dad had made his wishes that clear, why had they been acting like the ranch was already slipping away from me? Then I found the recent notes. Someone had been asking about the ranch, its value, the taxes, the cost of keeping it running. And then I saw something that made my heart stop. There was a name beside a note that said, "Interested buyer." They weren't just asking questions. They were preparing for someone to buy the ranch. And suddenly, I understood their confidence. They knew the ranch was expensive to maintain. They knew about the bills I'd been dealing with since Dad died. They thought those expenses would eventually scare me into selling. And honestly, they weren't completely wrong. There had been nights when I sat at my kitchen table staring at those numbers, wondering how long I could keep everything going by myself. They thought that made me weak. They thought it made the ranch vulnerable, but they didn't know everything about me. They didn't know what I had been quietly preparing for. I closed the folder and picked up my phone, because if they already had a buyer waiting, I needed to know who it was. I called the number beside the buyer's name. A man answered. I asked if he was interested in my father's ranch. There was a pause. Then he said, "Someone already contacted me about it." My heart started racing. I asked who. He gave me the name. It was the same man who had sold my father's cattle. But then the buyer said something I wasn't expecting. "He told me you were going to sell because you couldn't keep up with the expenses." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I suddenly understood exactly what they had been doing. They had been creating a story about me, the grieving daughter who couldn't handle the ranch, the woman who would eventually run out of money, the person who would have no choice but to sell. And they had been telling that story to people before I even knew there was a plan. I asked the buyer one more question. How much were they offering you? He told me. I wrote the number down. Then I stared at it for a long time because it was far lower than what my father's ranch was actually worth. They weren't just trying to push me out. They were trying to make money from my situation. And the worst part, they thought I didn't have another option. I thanked the buyer and hung up. For the first time since Dad died, I wasn't scared. I was angry, but I wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. Instead, I opened my bank account, looked at the numbers, and made a decision. I hadn't even considered that morning. If they were already planning to sell my father's ranch, maybe I should be the one making the offer. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about the number the buyer had given me. They had already decided what my future was supposed to look like. Sell the ranch, take the money, walk away. Maybe they thought that was all I could do. But the next morning, I called the buyer again. This time, I wasn't asking questions. I made him an offer. He went quiet. Then he asked, "You want to buy the ranch?" Yes. There was something almost unbelievable about saying it out loud, but I wasn't making a wild decision. Dad had left me enough savings to give me a real option. I just hadn't been thinking about using them this way, and now I had a choice. I could use that money to walk away from everything my father had built, or use it to make sure nobody else could take it from me. There was just one important detail. The man on the phone wasn't the owner. He was the buyer they had been negotiating with. He told me he would have to talk to the seller before anything could happen. I understood. Then he asked why I suddenly wanted the ranch. I looked out the window at the land my father had spent his life building, because it belongs in my family. That's all I said. I didn't tell him about the cattle. I didn't tell him about the lies. And I definitely didn't tell the man who started all of this. I wanted to see what they would do when they thought their plan was still working. Later that afternoon, he called me. He sounded almost cheerful. He asked if I had thought about selling. I kept my voice calm. "I'm considering my options." He seemed relieved. That was the moment I knew he had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. He thought I was preparing to surrender. But while he was waiting for me to give up, I was preparing to take the entire ranch out of his hands. And then the buyer called me back. The buyer called me back that evening. His voice sounded different, more serious. "I talked to the owner," he said. "They're willing to sell." For a second, I couldn't speak. My father's ranch was still tied up in the estate process. and I finally had a real chance to keep it in the family. But then the buyer said something I wasn't expecting. "There's something else you should know." My stomach tightened. He explained that when the man who sold my cattle first contacted him, he hadn't just talked about the cattle. He had talked about the ranch, the land, the barns, everything. Then he told me what he'd been told about me. He said you were already going to lose the ranch. I froze, so that's why. The cattle hadn't been some random decision. They were part of the story he was building. He wanted the buyer to believe I was already giving up, that the ranch was falling apart, that buying everything from him would simply be the next step. Suddenly, every strange thing I'd found made sense. The questions about the ranch, the buyer, the cattle sale, the pressure, it had all been leading toward the same thing. They weren't trying to take a few cattle from me. They were trying to make me look like I had already lost everything. But they made one huge mistake. They gave me enough time to fight back. A few days later, the deal closed. I signed the papers, and just like that, I own my father's entire ranch. Every acre, every pasture, every barn. The first person I saw afterward was him. He looked at me, then at the paperwork. "You actually bought it?" I nodded. He couldn't hide the shock. "You couldn't afford this." I looked across the land my father had spent his life building. "Maybe you should have asked before deciding what I could afford." For once, he had nothing to say, and standing there, I realized something. He thought he was selling pieces of my father's legacy. All he really did was give me the reason to protect all of it. Would you have fought to keep your family's ranch? Or taken the money and walked away? The next morning I walked out to the pasture before sunrise. For the first time in weeks, everything was quiet. No phone calls, no arguments, no paperwork spread across my kitchen table. Just the ranch. And standing there, I thought about Dad. He used to tell me that a ranch wasn't really about the land. It was about taking care of something that mattered to you. I never realized how much those words had stayed with me. After he died, I thought he had left me a ranch to manage, something expensive, something complicated, something I might not be strong enough to handle on my own. But I was wrong. He had left me something much bigger. He had left me the belief that I belonged there, that I was capable of making the hard decisions, that I didn't have to hand over something I loved just because someone else thought they knew better. A few days later, I brought the cattle home. Watching them walk through those gates again nearly brought me to tears. Those same gates Dad had opened thousands of times. That same land he had worked until his hands were worn out. For a moment, it felt like I could hear him telling me to keep going. And I finally understood. Dad hadn't just left me a ranch. He had left me the courage to protect it. The cattle were home. The ranch was mine, and for the first time since losing him, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I knew I could handle it, not because I had all the answers, but because I had finally stopped believing I needed someone else's permission to be strong. Some things are worth more than money. Sometimes they're worth fighting for. What is one thing your family built that you'd never be willing to give up?